and policies of different countries. And here I would like to refer to basically the United States of America and China.
Okay, welcome to this online lecture, Central Asia and Middle East in the Changing Global Order. And this lecture is hosted by the East-West Bridge, which aims to act as a bridge between the East and the West, particularly between China and the world. So it's an open and inclusive international platform to promote civilizational engagement for global peace and prosperity. So my name is Jody Wen. I'm the moderator of today's event, and I'm right now a postdoc fellow at the Center for Strategic and Security Studies at Tsinghua University. And before, I'm a visiting scholar at the OSCAR in Oxford. So why today we open this lecture is because in March of this year, China successfully mediated behind the scenes, leading to a reconciliation between two major countries in the Middle East, is Saudi Arabia and Iran. And these countries agreed to restore diplomatic relations. And in this month, on May 19th, China hosted the China Central Asia Summit in Xi'an, and this summit marked China's first major diplomatic event of this year, and the first time in 31 years of diplomatic relations that had heads of the state from these 6 countries gathered in person. So these two significant diplomatic events demonstrated China's growing influence as a major power on the world diplomatic stage and have a far-reaching implication for the evolving global order. So today we are delighted to invite Mushahid Hossain, Chairman of the Senate Defense Committee of Pakistan and President of the China-Pakistan Friendship Association, to be our main speaker. Welcome. Yeah, and the commentator will be Daghl Ali. He's a British South Asia political analyst who has published 8 books on China-US relations. So this lecture will be divided into 3 parts. The senator will speak for about 40 minutes, and the commentator will talk about maybe 50 minutes, and we'll leave 15 minutes to our audience to raise questions. So next, let me warmly introduce our speaker today, Senator Mushahid Hossain. He is a current Pakistan senator and the chairman of the Senate Defense and National Security Committee. And his distinguished career in the Pakistan public service as a 4-time elected senator includes positions such as the chairman of the Prime Minister's Task Force on Central Asia, and the Special Assistant to Prime Minister, and the Minister for Information, Cultural Tourism. And in April 2015, President Xi Jinping personally bestowed on him the prestigious 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence Award. So Senator Mushahid is a co-chairman of the International Conference of Asia-Pacific Political Parties and is currently a practitioner in residence at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., USA, where he mentors and lectures senior students on international relations. So he has contributed as and articles to international mainstream media such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and published 3 books, including Pakistan and the Changing Regional Scenario, and Pakistan Politics, the Governance in Pakistan. So he is the founder of the Islamabad Policy Research Institute and the Pakistan-China Institute, and Action for Climate Change. A very long introduction, but we have to do that because it's a warming introduction for Senator. So next, let's welcome Senator to give us a very important keynote speech, okay?
Thank you very much. Greetings from Islamabad. In the name of the Almighty, the Lord of all mankind, Ni hao to our Chinese listeners, and good afternoon and Assalamu alaikum to others. It's a great pleasure and pride for me to be at this August forum, the East-West Bridge, courtesy my good friend, Professor Ko King Ki. And also it's good to reconnect with Dr. Ali, whom I knew decades earlier. Now, not that we are very old, but we started out very young. And of course, Madame Jody Wen from Tsinghua and other friends, most welcome. We are discussing this topic at a time when there is turbulence, when there is transformation taking place in the world and in Asia. And this transformation and turbulence provides us with a number of challenges, but many opportunities also. And let's see how the world is changing. What is the emerging world order? Or is it an emerging world disorder? Let's look at some of the recent statements of world leaders, which shows how the world is changing. President Biden of the United States has termed it the decisive decade, the decade which we are living through. President Putin of Russia has said this is the most dangerous decade after World War II. President Xi Jinping has said, and I quote, "We are witnessing once-in-a-century changes." The Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, a leading publication of the United States, where he said, and I quote, "The world is witnessing epochal tectonic changes." And tectonic means when there's an earthquake. That's when they say tectonic change. And a very important statement was made by President Macron of France when he addressed French ambassadors to different countries last year in Paris. And he said, and I quote, 300 years of Western hegemony is now coming to an end. Ladies and gentlemen, the French president is saying 300 years of Western hegemony, Western domination is coming to an end. So we see an inexorable shift in the global balance of economic and political power away from the West, the United States of America, Europe, towards Asia. And the 21st century is being seen as the Asian century, with China as the rising power. So this is a very historic transformation, a slow but sure shift in the global balance of power. And we see contrasting visions which are reflected in actions and policies of different countries. And here I would like to refer to basically the United States of America and China. Let us see what has happened this month of May. Today is 31st of May. Look at the developments in May in our region. We talk of Central Asia, we talk of Middle East, we talk of Asia, we talk of the world order. Let me recount some of these significant changes and what do they mean for the emerging world order. On 6th of May, the Chinese foreign minister, Qin Gang, visited Islamabad. His first visit after taking office as the new foreign minister after the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of China. And the meeting was a trilateral meeting of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China, foreign ministers of the three countries. And a very important decision was taken at this meeting that CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the pivot, which is the flagship of the Belt and Road Initiative, that will now be extended beyond Pakistan and China to Afghanistan. In other words, Afghanistan will now become part of the Belt and Road Initiative with projects linked with Pakistan and China. Both are neighbors of Afghanistan. Pakistan has 2,600 kilometers of border with Afghanistan. China has 76 kilometers of border with Afghanistan through Xinjiang province. So this is very significant. The expansion of CPEC, the outreach of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is probably the single most important developmental and diplomatic initiative in the 21st century, launched by President Xi Jinping 10 years ago. And this year, 2023, we are celebrating 10 years of the Belt and Road Initiative and 10 years of CPEC, in which China has invested $26 billion. Over 150,000 Pakistanis have got jobs. It has generated electricity. It has built infrastructure. 40,000 Pakistani students are now studying in China. So it's about roads, railways, ports, pipelines, economy, energy, education. It's multifaceted, multidimensional. And it extends from 2015, CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, till 2030. So that is one major development in May. On 7th of May, the National Security Advisor of the American president, his name is Jake Sullivan, he visited Saudi Arabia. The first visit of a top American official after the Iran-Saudi rapprochement, which was brokered in March by China. And please don't forget, before that, President Xi Jinping in November visited Saudi Arabia, which was a very famous visit. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was accompanied by the National Security Advisor of India, Mr. Ajit Doval. And he said, we are meeting the Prime Minister of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who is also known as MBS. And the purpose is to link up Middle East with South Asia via India to infrastructure and other projects. So the Americans are now talking of a copycat project of the BRI. BRI is about infrastructure, socio-economic development, connectivity. Americans are now talking the same language. After denouncing, criticizing, condemning BRI, they are trying to now say that we want to connect the regions through connectivity, physical connectivity, rail and road. And he said through India. And why India? Because India is a strategic partner of the United States of America in the new Cold War against China in the region. Others are Japan and Australia. These are very key strategies. That was 7th of May. On 9th of May, the leaders of Central Asian republics, 5 countries, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, they were in Moscow on 9th of May with President Putin for the 9th of May victory parade of the victory of the Red Army of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany, which ended the World War. The war in Europe ended on 9th of May, 1945. And the war in Europe, in Asia ended on 15th of August, 1945, when Japan surrendered. So the Central Asian republics were there, their leadership, to show solidarity with President Putin. But even a more important meeting took place, which Madam Jody mentioned just now. on 18th and 19th of May in Xi'an. And that was the first China Central Asia Summit. And these countries I mentioned, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, they were all there, the leaders. And they agreed for a blueprint for Central Asia jointly with China, with multifaceted cooperation. And mind you, this comes in the context of three major initiatives of President Xi Jinping in the last 2 years. The Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, which is about connectivity among commerce and culture in countries and civilizations. And the last important meeting which took place in May was on 24th of May in Hiroshima, G7 summit. But Prime Minister Modi of India was specially invited. And there they had a meeting of the Quad. Quad means US, India, Australia, and Japan. This is the anti-China gang up, which is part of the new Cold War, which we see emerging in Asia. And this meeting on 24th May came with the announcement that for the first time in the history after World War II, an office of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that will be established in Tokyo. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are seeing two contrasting visions in this emerging world. One is a vision of a new Cold War. One is a vision which is driven by a security-centric approach, military-centered approach by the United States, where they say Russia is the enemy in Europe and China is the enemy in Asia. The other vision is of China and President Xi Jinping, of connectivity, of cooperation, while the Western vision or the US vision is more about confrontation, conflict. So these are two contrasting visions. And I just want to give you the context of the visions also. From 2001, after 9/11, till 2021, when the American forces were forced to leave Afghanistan on 15th of August 2021, the US spent or squandered $6.5 trillion in the so-called war on terror in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia. And these are figures given by the Brown University in the United States, not my figures. Institute of the Study of Conflict, you can find it on the internet, Google. 324,000 bombs, missiles, and drones were thrown in these countries. 900,000 people lost their lives in these countries. 30 million people were homeless in these countries or displaced or refugees. From 9/11, 2001 to 2021. In the same period, China was building or investing in projects, 4,000 projects in different parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, Europe. China focusing on economic development, trade investment, the US focused on military-centered. These are the contrasting visions. And now let us take these two regions separately also. As was mentioned by Jody, the Iran-Saudi rapprochement brokered by China is historic. It has brought about a fundamental change in the dynamics and politics of the Middle East. After 40 years of a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, since the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 79, there is peace. And this proxy war is affecting other Muslim countries. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, Lebanon. Pro this and pro that has come. And this rapprochement has led to a rapprochement with Syria being allowed back into the Arab League. Everybody has welcomed Syria's return to the Arab League except the United States of America. They have condemned. And they have imposed new sanctions on Syria. They are not happy with this rapprochement. The Yemen war is coming to an end because of this rapprochement. And UAE-Iran relations have been restored. Qatar, UAE, Qatar, Saudi relations have been restored. So it's a sea change in the Middle East. The other important development in the Middle East is under Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman, there is a silent revolution taking place in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. A social transformation which is historic. And I've written an article which I will send to Professor Ko, and I will request him to circulate it. I wrote it last week in the Pakistani press. I said the silent revolution in Saudi Arabia is, I said, MBS going to be another Deng Xiaoping, a reformer who is doing a course correction, who is opening up his society, and who is putting economic issues ahead of ideology, ahead of other things, to build a better, peaceful, prosperous tomorrow for his people. Well, China is a success story. So that is a very important element of the emerging Middle East. Reconciliation, rapprochement. And please be very clear that in these changes, there is no role of an outside power. Normally it was the US or Britain or France who would decide what kind of relations you have. They would be ones involved in this process. This is for the first time an Asian country, China, building the bridges between two other Asian countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia. So Asian hands are determining the destiny of Asia, not Western, not European, not American. But the most significant change in the Middle East, which needs to be understood, is that for 70 years, there was an understanding or agreement, if you will. It was called oil for security. The US would buy, the US would get cheap, uninterrupted supply of oil to fuel their industry from Saudi Arabia, from these Arab countries. In return, the US would provide security, military security, security from threats, all kinds of threats. That understanding has fallen. It's no longer there because the US, they have shale gas, their reliance on Saudi oil is no longer there. They don't need the Saudis. As you know, the US has short memories and shifting alliances and relations. So that has also changed. So that is why Saudi Arabia is looking for new partners, new friends, new allies to promote its economic and political interests. The opening to China, the relationship with Russia, it's all part of that process. Now, I would also briefly like to look at the Central Asian. We talked about Middle East and Central Asia. Then we look at the broader picture. Central Asia, I mentioned the 5 republics, former Soviet republics, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. They are part now of, except I think Turkmenistan, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SC, which is becoming a lead organization. And this is a very mineral-rich, natural resources-rich countries. And this is a very important part of the Silk Road Economic Belt, as well as the Belt and Road Initiative. Please note that the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative came in September 2013 by President Xi Jinping in Astana, in the capital of Kazakhstan 10 years ago. And the first visit of President Xi Jinping outside China after the COVID was to Kazakhstan, which shows their importance. And the first summit which President Xi Jinping hosted after COVID is with Central Asia. The Central Asia is now a part of the core interest of China. Xinjiang province is very important. They have this connection. So it's linked with pipelines, oil pipelines, gas pipelines. We have in Pakistan, the Iran-Pakistan pipeline. We have the TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. Then there is another linkage with the Kazakhstan, with Tajikistan called KASA. Central Asia, South Asia, electricity grid. In fact, there is talk of so many pipelines in the region that people say there will be a Pipelineistan in the region, linking up the different countries to secure energy security. And Central Asia is also very important. You saw what happened in Kazakhstan in January 2020. There was an uprising or an attempted coup d'etat. Russian troops came in and Chinese investment came in. And I think that's very important that China and Russia are partners in preserving, promoting, and protecting the security and stability of Central Asia. And they want to do it by regional countries. They do not want the Americans there. They do not want other countries from outside things. And that in itself is. Now, when we look at the broader picture, Pakistan, of course, is the closest country to Central Asia in terms of their gateway to the outside world. It's through the Chinese-built port of Gawad. 2,000 kilometers, 2,500 kilometers, whether it's Kashgar and Urumqi in China, whether it's Dushanbe in Tajikistan, or Almaty in Kazakhstan, or Ashkabad in Turkmenistan, or Tashkent or Termez in Uzbekistan, and Almaty in Kazakhstan, of course. So, and Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. The closest outlet for the Central Asian republics to the outside world is through Pakistan, through Afghanistan and Pakistan. To the port of Gwadar, which is a deep sea port built by China in 2007 and handed over to Pakistan. And Gwadar is the central piece of CPEC, the China-Pakistan corridor, which is the pivot and flagship of the PRI. And the Gwadar port provides for transshipment and transit trade between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Because from Gwadar to Kandahar, it's 900 kilometers. So this whole region is being connected through geoeconomics. And that, I think, is extremely important also, because this geoeconomics will now drive the connectivity between China, Central Asia, South Asia, and Iran, Afghanistan, and even the Gulf. And in this regard, I would like to mention that Iran also has signed an agreement with China for 25 years. People say they have signed last March 2022, and people say it will lead to about an investment of about $400 billion in 25 years. So the region is becoming transformed through this connectivity. Now we see the talk of a new Cold War. And I said there are two visions. One is a vision of connectivity, vision of cooperation, enunciated by China, by President Xi Jinping, and I mentioned his initiatives, BRI, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Development Bank, BRICS, SCO. But other hand, the US still has a military mission. They're building up their linkages with India. Special relationships. And India, China have clashed on the border. in May 2020 and January 2020. In fact, out of 13 neighbors of China, only India and Bhutan have unresolved border issues with China. That is also bothersome to China in this context. And what are the contours of this rivalry, this new Cold War? I think the core of it is technology. There is a study done by Harvard University, which came out, I think, last year in November 2022. And it is written by a professor of Harvard University, Professor Graham Allison, Allison. The title is The Great Tech Rivalry, China versus the United States. And what does this American study say? This is Harvard University. They say China is overtaking the United States in high-tech manufacturing. They say, for example, last year, China produced 1.5 billion cell phones, 250 million computers, 25 million automobiles. In STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, STEM, China's graduates are almost double than the United States. China, I think last year was 77,000 graduates. America has 40,000. And out of those 40,000, half of them are Asians anyway. Chinese, Koreans, Indians, Pakistanis, and so forth. So this gap is artificial intelligence, cloud computing, 5G, robotics. In all these fields, China is becoming a leader in innovation, excellence. China used to be the world's biggest factory, then became the world's biggest civil engineer. Then it became into construction. Now it is leading in innovation. And those of you who followed the Beijing Winter Olympics last year, 80% of the Olympic Games were run by robots. Robots were guiding you. Robots were telling you what to do. So it's a very advanced feature. And China is leading in that. And already you can see out of 193 countries, which are members of the United Nations, 130 countries have more trade with China than they have with the United States of America. From the Solomon Islands to Saudi Arabia. And recently, President Biden was keen to visit the Pacific Islands, and he had planned a visit to Papua New Guinea for the first time. Why was he doing that? Because Xi Jinping visited Papua New Guinea in 2018, 5 years ago. America is now 5 years too late. And I've written an article on that. Last year, I went to Washington. I addressed a think tank conference on China. And they say, confronting China, containing China. This article of mine appeared in an American publication called The National Interest. I'll send it to Professor Koh. Please distribute. The US-China Cold War, I called it. I said, the Americans, I told them, you have missed the bus. China is now, it's too late to progress. And I quoted a statement by President Carter, who's still living. And this is a conversation President Carter had with President Trump in July 2018, when Trump was the president. And President Carter addresses his church congregation in his hometown of Plains, Georgia, every Sunday. And he said, I got a call last week, he told his people, from President Trump. And he said, Mr. President, he asked President Carter, tell me, what do we do? China is forging ahead. We are being left behind. How do we compete with China? How do we confront with China? And he said, Mr. President, he told Carter, that you had invited Deng Xiaoping in 1979 to Washington. Remember when Deng Xiaoping was wearing his Stetson hat and he visited America? It was a great visit. President Carter replied, Mr. President, since that period, 40 years ago, the US has been at war in all the 40 years, while China has been at peace all these 40 years. China has not invaded, occupied, conquered, or annexed any country or any region. That is the difference. While the US has been busy fighting wars after wars. So in this contrasting context, I think it's very important to understand that the US is now, they have what is called the military industrial complex. That is the heart of the American security establishment. It includes the Pentagon, the war machine, the CIA, other elements, of very hawkish elements. They see the China threat. And I also feel there is an element of racism in that, frankly. Because China is the first non-Western, non-white power that has confronted or that has challenged Western in the last few centuries. So they cannot understand how China can do it. And they have passed in America a Strategic Competition Act. It's a law now. Under that law, the US will spend $300 million a year on countering China influence fund. What does that mean? Countering China influence fund, it means propaganda, information warfare against China. Oh, China's debt trap diplomacy. China's BRI is doing that. China is so-called human rights. They're weaponizing democracy. They're weaponizing human rights. And Professor Ko and I were together at some conference in Beijing where they were discussing these things. So that is the main thing. They have developed a China house. They say Huawei is a threat also. 5G is a threat. And conductors, semiconductors, microconductors, they are being threatened. So they are trying to pressure China. One other aspect which has been helpful to the developing countries, third world, I like to mention in this context, is the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war has brought about a new kind of divide between the global north, which is Europe and America, and the global south, which is developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin. Like Pakistan, China, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Mexico, South Africa, they have all abstained on Ukraine. They did not condemn Ukraine like the West wanted us to. So we do not share the view. We see the Ukraine war as a Western war, it's a European war. It's not our war. It's part of the new Cold War against Russia, because Americans want to fight to the last Ukrainian and the expansion of NATO. We don't believe in the expansion of NATO. Cold War is officially over, with Soviet Union has ceased to exist. And now you want to bring NATO into the Asia also. And you see the NATO document. NATO in 2030, which was issued after the summit in Madrid last year. What did they say? They said there are two threats to NATO. One Russia, one China. I asked a NATO official, I said, China is 3,000 miles away from the North Atlantic. How is China threatening the North Atlantic? How is China threatening NATO? This is part of that mentality. So this kind of mentality has to be rejected. And we have to take it forward. So we are very lucky that this transformation that is taking place in the world, this is no longer a unipolar world. It is a multipolar world with multiple power centers and people believing in multilateralism. And that is what takes it. I would like to end my lecture with two articles, which I think I would recommend to this informed readership. One is an article by Fareed Zakaria, which came in Foreign Affairs, which is the American publication. It's called The New China Scare. And it says that actually China is not a threat, but it is being conjured up. It is being concocted. It is being created as a threat by the military-industrial complex in the United States, because they need an enemy. It was the Soviet Union in the past in the Cold War, then it was Islam in the Muslim world after 9/11. Now it's China's turn. The other article was by an American lady, Fiona Hill, and she was special assistant to Trump. And she has written in Foreign Affairs also, article on the Ukraine war and its consequences. And the bottom line of that argument, I think that sums up the emerging world order. What is, if you can capsulize it, how does some, and I quote from that article, and she writes, and it's in the Foreign Affairs, in 2023, we hear a resounding no to US domination and see a marked appetite for a world without a hegemon. That is the meaning. And the US has tried to use the Ukraine war to link it with Taiwan. And they say, oh, the Russians have attacked Ukraine, and the Chinese are trying to do the same thing, although there's no linkage. China has always believed in the universal principles of peaceful coexistence and respect for unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. China has never condoned any aggression. And one reason for China's peaceful foreign policy, its approach, its worldview and values are different. Because they say China is a rising power and it has to be aggressive or militarist. It's not true. And I say that is because of China's strategic culture. China's strategic culture is very different because the roots of today's China's worldview, values, foreign policy, and policies led by Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China stem from that strategic culture. And these 3-4 components of the Chinese strategic culture are important to us. What are those? Number one, the Silk Road. Historically, started 2,000 years ago from Xi'an, it was connecting cultures and continents through commerce, through interaction, human level. And today's BRI is a revival of the Silk Road of 2000. So China is into globalization. In fact, I think in human history, the first example of globalization is the Silk Road, because that was based on connectivity, 2,000 years ago. Second, China's strategic culture, which shapes its worldview and values, the Great Wall of China. It is protective, it is defensive against any foreign invaders or aggressors. It is inward looking. China is not trying to expand, China is going to defend itself from outside in. That is part of the Chinese strategic culture, their world. The third component of China's strategic culture is the Long March, the People's Liberation Army. From 1934 to 35, 1 year, 100,000 people went on this Long March. It was a retreat. Only 20,000 survived. Chairman Mao's wife, his 2 children also died in the Long March. Very tough. They were facing pressure from the Kuomintang. It was a battle for survival. But that showed what is important for lesson from that? Patience, perseverance, and China never gives up on the point of principle. They stick to that like a rock. And the fourth and final component of China's strategic culture, as I see it, the century of humiliation. If you read the book of Xi Jinping, The Governance of China, the 3 volumes, there's a lot of reference to the century of humiliation. From 1840, the Opium Wars were imposed on China by the West, to 1949, the liberation of China. And if those of you who have been to Shanghai and visited the museums, in the 30s, they used to have 4 enclaves in Shanghai. French enclave, British enclave, German enclave, American enclave. The laws were of those countries, not China. Chinese sovereignty was undermined. And the clubs in those enclaves had a signboard outside, Chinese and dogs not allowed. This was the century of humiliation. And that is why on 1st October 1949, great leader Chairman Mao announced, and Tiananmen Square, the gate of heavenly peace, Today, the Chinese nation has stood up. That is the important. So you had the revolution under Chairman Mao, you have the reform under Deng Xiaoping, and you have the rise of China, the peaceful rise of China under President Xi Jinping, which is welcomed by countries like Pakistan because it's a source of strength and stability in the emerging world order. Those who are so-called world powers, they have a problem with that. That is why they're trying to be on that side. Finally, somebody asked me, which side are you on, China or the United States? I said, I am on the right side of history. And the right side of history is the Asian century, building a better tomorrow without overlords and without underdogs. Thank you so much. I hope I finished on time.
Yeah, just 40 minutes exactly, I think. Yeah, you control the time. Yeah, you can control the time precisely. Yeah. So thanks so much for your wonderful sharing. And you mentioned the role for Central Asia and the Middle East in the changing global order. And what impressed me most is you talk about the global South, the choice towards the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Yeah, why global South holds a different view or position in this war. So I totally agree with your opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you. So next, let's warmly welcome Dr. Ali. He will have a comment on your speech. Okay. Welcome, Dr. Ali.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It will be a comment not just on the Senator's remarks, but I'll say an overview of roughly what the Senator also talked about, transitions and changes in the world system. Obviously, I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in this illuminating event, so thoughtfully keynoted by an eminent Pakistani practitioner, legislator, and strategic analyst. I thank the organizers for inviting me. As we have heard, Beijing's mediation in the Iran-Saudi rapprochement is a remarkable instance of the Chinese approach to diplomacy in areas where other actors dominated for decades. Senator Mushaid Hussain Sayyed's remarks illuminated that success from a fraternal perspective. I first met Senator Hussain in Islamabad, as he hinted, in October 1990, when I was gathering material for a BBC radio documentary on the Pressler Amendment to the United States Foreign Assistance Act, whose restrictions had been imposed on Pakistan the previous month, owing to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. As long as Pakistan's help was vital to recruiting, training, and arming Mujahideen militias fighting Soviet forces occupying Afghanistan, Presidents Reagan and then Bush issued annual waivers so that Pakistan could continue receiving US aid and fight the good fight. Washington accused Beijing of providing Islamabad with nuclear blueprints and some material. But when Soviet forces left and Mujahideen militias took control of Afghanistan, the Pressler Amendment was enforced with sanctions targeting Pakistan. Since I had begun my own career as an army officer 2 decades earlier, I initially made contact with several retired Pakistani officers. One of them recommended the editor of a daily newspaper, I think the Muslim, Mr. Mushaid Hussain, our keynote speaker today. I met him at his Islamabad residence, where he was not only a most gracious host, but also a candid and insightful observer of South Asia's strategic and security, or more accurately, regional insecurity dynamics. Later, when I flew to Delhi to engage with Indian experts on the same subject, Senator Hussain's remarks stood me in good stead in exploring Indian perspectives. Using material gathered from both sides of the border, the documentary was considered to be balanced and objective intervention on a critically important and topical subject that remains relevant today. But as a student of history engaged in studying China-US relations for nearly 4 decades, I believe I could perhaps usefully share a contextual perspective to today's discussion. Around 52 years ago, when I was an officer cadet at the Pakistan Military Academy, Islamabad served as the crucial jumping-off point for Dr. Henry Kissinger's first historic and secret July 1971 trip to Beijing, pretending to fall ill during a dinner hosted by Pakistan's President, General Yahya Khan, and then seemingly riding to a hill station to recuperate, Kissinger actually took a Pakistani aircraft from Islamabad to Beijing, spending 17 hours in meetings with Premier Zhou Enlai over 2.5 days. And now, of course, we know that President Yahya Khan had, in November 1970, carried a handwritten note from President Nixon to Chairman Mao via Premier Zhou, a letter Zhou later described as, and I quote, from a head, to a head, through a head, unquote. At Nixon's behest, Kissinger had sought French, Polish, and Romanian conduits to reach out to Beijing. But China's leaders waited until Yahya Khan brought that first unsigned message. For China, too, strategic concerns proceeded on a parallel path, unbeknownst to most US officials. In March 1969, Sino-Soviet border clashes on the Chenbao-Damansky Island on the Ussuri River reflected and reinforced passions on both sides. Soviet officials informally broached with US counterparts plans to bomb Chinese nuclear facilities. On Nixon's orders, US officials forbade any strikes on China. In August, fresh bloody border clashes in Xinjiang raised fears of Sino-Soviet escalation. By then, Chairman Mao had assigned 4 of the Red Army's 10 marshals to study China's strategic ecology and recommend steps to defend the PRC's long-term interests. The 4 marshals came up with a formulation that both superpowers threatened China, but the near enemy posed acute and more immediate threats than the far enemy. Against that backdrop, when Pakistan's president brought the message from Nixon, Beijing was ready. However, dissent, as we know, led to Marshal Lin Biao's attempt to change this new policy direction. But his attempted coup proved abortive. The rest, as you know, is history. China and Pakistan have been iron brothers for decades, as we heard. In the December 1971 India-Pakistan War, that relationship manifested itself in the T-59 tanks in my neighboring cavalry regiment and the 122mm anti-tank guns in my own battalion. The China-Pakistan relationship has matured over decades to the point that while US-China relations have dipped arguably to their lowest level since the Korean War, Sino-Pakistani ties have seen the steady implementation of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, as we heard from the senator, a flagship component of China's Belt and Road or BRI vision. In 2017, when Pakistan's National Defense University, Bahria or Naval University, and the Pakistan Air Force Air War College invited me to speak to faculty and student officers about China-US relations and their impact on Pakistan, I cautioned them about the prospects for severe tensions between the systemic primate, the USA, and the actor the USA saw as its most serious challenger, China. My audiences appeared to be skeptical. Just months after my return from Islamabad and Karachi, President Donald Trump signed off on his national security strategy document, openly identifying China as the US's most dangerous grand strategic rival. A series of national security or grand strategy-related policy papers flowing from the Trump administration reinforced the message in greater detail. The tariff or trade war followed, and then, as we know, a science and technology war, which is still in progress. Trump's great power competition rhetoric is now the bipartisan consensus and conceptual paradigm uniting Democrats and Republicans, civil and military, and US elites and masses. The Biden administration has revised and refined the same counter-China approach with far greater allied engagement, as was evident at the consecutive Group of Seven or G7 and Quad and AUKUS summits in Hiroshima, as the senator mentioned. And Hiroshima is the symbolic first city bombed by the USA with a nuclear weapon. Still, host Japan played a most energetic role in underscoring the fear of China as the organizing principle for widening and deepening the US-led counter-China coalition. President Biden remarked on the possibility of US-China tensions easing and declining soon, but his leadership of the expanding counter-China coalition had a more polarizing impact than his emollient words indicated. As we know, for 2 decades since 1969, when Nixon asked Kissinger to fashion secret diplomatic bridges to Beijing, the USA viewed China as its most crucial partner, even a tacit ally. But the Soviet Union's fission and the US's emergence as the sole superpower or systemic primate ended US reliance on China. Less than 4 months after Soviet collapse, President Bush, the 41st president, signed the Defense Planning Guidance Fiscal 1994-1999, proclaiming perpetual or at least indefinite primacy to be defended militarily as America's grand strategic goal. In August 1999, the Office of Net Assessment, the United States Department of Defense's Horizon Scanning Policy Planning internal think tank, identified China as an emerging, and I quote, constant competitor, unquote, willing and able to challenge US primacy or world leadership in more formal language. Almost immediately, President Bill Clinton and the US Congress, working separately, moved to isolate China and reduce its future power potential and capability. But distracted by counter-terrorist wars of choice, the USA focused elsewhere for a decade. Then, in 2010, China overtook Japan as the world's second biggest economy, deepening US and allied concerns. In 2011, President Obama launched his Asian pivot, restoring Washington's strategic focus back to Beijing. China's unprecedented rapid economic growth, the resources which it made available for state-building purposes, particularly poverty alleviation, transport infrastructure, and communications networks, general and specialized advanced education, scientific development, automation and robotics, space ventures, advanced manufacturing and energy innovation, green technology, military modernization, and expanding diplomatic footprint, perhaps best seen in the Iran-Saudi rapprochement, also likely expansion of the BRICS grouping, and in steady BRI implementation, as well as Beijing's assertion of its historical claims on Taiwan, and in the near seas, that is the South China Sea and the East China Sea, taken together, set off alarm bells ringing in some capitals. Elites there, discerning revisionist threats to the post-Soviet unipolar order, discounted China's stated desire for peaceful development. Although since the 1980s, China has openly espoused a multipolar vision in which China too would be one of several poles. This particular, the current shift from a unipolar to a possibly multipolar order, openly challenged US interest more recently. Now, if you allow me a very brief foray into conceptual constructs. As we know, the international security system comprises several concentric circles of interstate interactions. The center or core is occupied by the greatest of great powers, or superpowers, if you like. During the Cold War, the USA and the USSR occupied the bipolar systemic core. To outmatch the Soviet Union, the USA invited China towards the core. After the Soviet collapse, the core became unipolar with the USA as the sole superpower or systemic primate or the world leader. Now, China's comprehensive national power has brought it into the core in its own right, inadvertently but effectively reducing the USA to just one of two so-called superpowers. The gradual construction of a Eurasian supercontinental coalition linking China, Russia, and Central Asia into a power center that could challenge US primacy, as arguably witnessed at the recent Sino-Central Asian Summit in Xi'an, grips Western strategists with profound anxiety. With Sino-Russian collaboration growing, the Cold War era power balance now seems to face dramatic reversal. This US leaders find very threatening indeed. Officials identified three converging trends: willingness and ability to question US interests. Secondly, Russian actions reversing aspects of the Soviet collapse. And thirdly, deepening Sino-Russian collaboration against US preferences, notably in the Eurasian security arena. The year 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and China built 7 bases on reclaimed reefs and islets in the South China Sea, effectively marked the end of US unipolarity. US inability to prevent these actions in the face of growing Sino-Russian triggered what I have termed systemic transitional fluidity, which is itself a function of US displacement anxiety. Now, both systemic transitional fluidity and the current primate's displacement anxiety are structural functions of geopolitical changes that have widely been described as power shift or power transition. We know that no primate voluntarily cedes its status. Britain did that to the USA at the end of the Second World War for economic, political, and cultural compulsions and convergences. But the USA doesn't see comparable features in China. So the big picture possibilities are either the USA and its allies keep pressing China, trying to contain it within the first island chain until an incident spirals into conflict and escalates beyond control, or China accepts subordination to the primate and its unipolar order, or the USA accepts that China cannot be contained and adopts a collegial and collaborative post-unipolar posture. It's got to be one of these three. We cannot know the future, but on the basis of experience, we can foresee likely outcomes. I'm concluding now. As the two competing powers are nuclear-armed, technologically advanced economies with a mixed history of cooperation and coercion, tinged with tacit ethnocultural divergences, or crudely racism, their unequal, non-reciprocal adapt. We can only hope that deterrence born of the fear of mutual assured destruction will prove its efficacy once again, but this time in a post-unipolar era. Humanity is in grim danger if it doesn't. Thanks for your attention.
Very good. Excellent.
Yeah. Dr. Tali, thanks. You had talked many about the China-US relationship and your very sincere outlook for this two relationship. Yeah. So next, maybe we will have we will come into our Q&A stage. So maybe audience, I mean, if you have any questions, you can leave your question in our blanket in the box. Yes. And I just wondering if Professor Kuo have any question?
No, I don't have any question. I just want to congratulate, the Senator and Dr. Ali for giving very good speeches, the best, since we have this East-West lecture. Congratulations and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if we do not have any question from the audience, maybe we can just, end here. Judy?
Yeah. Before that, maybe because I think this chance is very unique. Yes, and I want to talk a little about this because I hadn't been to Pakistan. Maybe it's 2018, and I saw my old friends in the in the audience. Yeah, there is a journalist called Kohan. He's here, and I met him in Renmin University maybe 5 years ago. Yeah, and at that time I'm a journalist too. So it's always very great to meet old friends, not only online or in person. So I think Pakistan is always our good friend. So I have one question. Okay, I have one question to Senator Harlin. It's because we all know that U.S. has proposed many mechanisms to contain China, like Quad and the AUKUS. So I don't know if you have noticed that is a mechanism in Middle East that's called I2E2. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you, or Dr. Ali can answer too, what's your perspective on this mechanism? Yeah, thank
you. I2U2, Israel, India, UAE, and US. So the 2 U's and 2 I's are there. This was initiated during the Trump period by his son-in-law, Mr. Kushner, basically to bring in Israel into the Arab mainstream and to get Israel's recognition. And they had an ally with India also, because at that time, Netanyahu was Prime Minister of Israel and Modi is the Prime Minister of India. And both have a similar view, which is based on a very narrow-based neo-fascist ideology on their own respective religious identities. In Zionism in the case of Israel and Hindutva in the case of India. And you can see that the policies are the same in Palestine, transforming a majority into a minority, and in occupied Kashmir, transforming a majority into a minority. So the purpose was, and they succeeded to some extent, they brought in Bahrain, apart from UAE, they brought in Morocco, they brought in the Sudan also in that process. But Saudi Arabia stood its ground. So it's more a mechanism for a new core alliance where they want to have the flanks covered with Israel in the Middle East and from India, South Asia. But, it's very interesting that these are non-Muslim powers. So the legitimacy and acceptability of these two countries in the Arab and the Muslim world would be limited. And now when they tried to bring in Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor of India, in the 7th of May meeting in Jeddah with the Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman, it was again the Americans trying to, do this. And now they're talking of South Asia and Middle East. Now it's taking shape as a Middle East counterpoint to the Belt and Road Initiative. But I would like to mention 2 things. Number one, UAE and Saudi Arabia are very close to China. They would not become part of any such, and also close to Russia, by the way, because Saudi Arabia has defied the American pressure. They said increase the oil production, and he lowered the oil production. And they said you shouldn't be buying oil from Russia like that. They've been doing that. So he's defied that, and I think that they will not be playing ball in that manner. And that kind of relationship which the United States wants from I2U2 as like Quad and AUKUS will not be possible, because the new realities are there, and we are seeing Muslim middle powers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and now Erdogan has won the elections in Turkey, and Pakistan. They are having more strategic space and more autonomy to pursue their respective foreign policies. I just want to add a point which was made by Dr. Ali, which is very relevant. And he mentioned the 2011 pivot to Asia. And that was by President Obama. And that was in November 2011. That after failing in the so-called war on terror and devastating the Muslim countries, they said we now have a pivot to Asia, which was the beginning of the anti-China strategy. But before the pivot to Asia in November 2011, I would like to remind the audience that in July 2011, Hillary Clinton went to Chennai, Madras, in India, and she announced the new Silk Road. The new Silk Road, she said, will start from India and then go on to South Asia and Afghanistan and Central Asia. And it was very interesting that I asked this question when the then Chinese foreign minister came to Pakistan a few months later. His name was Yang Jiechi. Dr. Ali and Mr. Ko would know about that. He was the former interpreter of Deng Xiaoping, a very brilliant Chinese statesman. Yang Jiechi, he's now retired. And later on, he became a Politburo member. I said, Excellency, what is this new Silk Road, which the Americans are talking about? And he said, there's only one Silk Road, which started 2,000 years ago in Xi'an. And where is this new Silk Road coming from India into that thing? So you can see the American strategy then was also that India on one side and Australia, where Obama made the speech, was in Australia, the pivot to Asia speech in the Australian Parliament. So they were trying to put that together, but that was 2011. So in 2012, the Chinese had their 18th Party Congress. Xi Jinping came over, and then he launched the BRI, and then the situation is totally different now. So the US tried to spark a new Cold War with China way back in 2011 through these two developments. I just want to put it on the record that this is historically the context of what we are seeing today, 12, 13 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Thank you for your answers. So, Dr. Ali, do you have anything to?
Jody, there's a question in the chat box.
Yeah, I saw that. So, may I raise a question for the audience? This he leaves a question. He's a Dr. Roy from the University of Malaysia, and he questioned about China's role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. The first question. And the first question is on the growing China's influence in Central Asia as demonstrated in the Sino-Central Asia Summit in Xi'an. So do you think in long term, the growing influence of China in Central Asia may cause Russia's unease as the region has been area of Russian influence? So these two questions. So maybe we can have
Okay.
Dr. Ali, maybe you can have one question, or Senator have the other, or you two can.
I can also make a brief attempt, if I may. Yes, Central Asia is a former Soviet region, and this is what they used to call the Russia's near abroad. Those 15, 16 Soviet republics. And Ukraine was by the way, part of that. Belarus was part of that also. The Baltic republics were part of that also. The Soviet Union or the Soviet Empire, they called it. So, but Central Asia was seen because a lot of Russian population also lives in Central Asia, especially in Kazakhstan. And Russia had this domination for a while. But now I would see that there is two aspects. Number one, the Chinese economic investment is more extensive after the last 10 years particularly. And that is why $70 billion worth of trade between China and Central Asia. That's number one. And Kyrgyz in Kazakhstan is the bridge between China and Central Asia, then linking up with the Eurasian heartland, which Dr. Ali also. And I think that needs to be very clearly defined. Secondly, there's also been a change in the relationship of China and Russia. China and Russia, especially after last year's summit in Beijing in February, just before the Ukraine war started, they talked of a new no limits partnership. And there is a strategic alliance now between China and Russia, which is quite overarching, and they see a common interest and common threat from the United States. So there is a commonality of interest, and those interests include, I think those interests by and large are, in my view, complementary. They are not in conflict between China and Russia. China also talks of BRI, Russia talks of Eurasian Economic Union, and then the linkage, they reinforce each other. And this example of this partnership was in Kazakhstan last year when the coup attempt failed, and I mentioned that in January 2022, Russian troops came in and then Chinese investment came in. So, there was the security and economy, they go hand in hand. And of course, Russia has been, I think, a bit damaged and weakened by the Ukraine war, because, yesterday there were even drones in Moscow. And Russia is now focusing totally on the war in Ukraine. 80% of the attention is there. But in the regional terms, in global worldview, the China and Russia alliance is very, very strong. So I think the Chinese investment in Central Asia is not a zero-sum game, that if it comes, it's the expense of the Russians. The Russians feel uneasy. I think that is complementary, and they both reinforce each other. So as of now, I think that this process will continue. And finally, I'd like to mention that when Xi Jinping went to Moscow in March, the 22nd, 23rd March, I remember what he said to Putin when Putin was seeing him off in the car. He said, "We are witnessing changes which have not been witnessed in a century, and we should drive these changes together." And he also said in an interview before that, while talking to and also talking to Putin, that next year there are elections in Russia, and we hope that the Russian people will vote for stability, continuity. So that was a hint of support for Putin, that forthcoming election. So that alliance is very rock solid as of now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. So, Dr. Ali, do you have anything to comment or to say?
Well, thank you. The senator has actually explained it so well. I don't think I can add anything except to say that if you look at Western commentary on Sino-Russian collaboration, there are two schools there. One school holds that this is a tactical marriage of convenience because it suits them. They're both weak or insecure, and that's why they're building up some sort of a relationship which is superficial, which is not in depth, which will not profound, and it will not have a major impact on world affairs. That's one school. The other school is truly concerned that the historical fear, which was first expressed in 1904 by Mackinder, that the Eurasian supercontinent is the world island at the center of the global terra firma, and anyone who controlled this massive territory from the Yellow Sea to the Baltic Sea, if you like, that area will control the world. And European powers, and more recently the United States, have tried very hard to keep Eurasia divided so that China and Russia are never sort of that close together, or together they should not be able to challenge US authority or power. But I think there is a recognition now that American policy has contributed greatly towards both Russian and Chinese insecurity. And that shared insecurity vis-a-vis the United States has contributed towards bringing China and Russia together. And I think to an extent, American strategists are at a loss as to how to break that cycle. That the United States has tried very hard to keep Russia and China apart, and in fact benefited enormously when the Soviet Union and China were sort of hostile to each other. The United States developed, and Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon said this in their statements to each other and within their own ruling circles, that the United States enjoys better relations with either China or Russia than Russia and China enjoy with each other. That was their grand strategic objective and their great success in attaining that. There was détente with the Soviet Union and sort of tacit alliance with China. But since the end of the Cold War and the Soviet collapse, I think the policies have been, how shall I put it, strategic, but not grand strategic. It has been short-sighted. If it was their objective to keep China and Russia apart, then they should have done things that they haven't done, and they shouldn't have done what they actually did. And there is some recognition in the realist school of this problem with US policy. And two scholars, American scholars, I can cite in this discussion, who point out American weaknesses. At least one of them is John Mearsheimer of Chicago University, who says that the USA should try to make friends with Russia because over the long term, the grand strategic challenge to American values and interests lies in China. And there is another one in Harvard, Walt, Professor Walt, at the Kennedy School. He also agrees with Mearsheimer, although his language is much more sober. But apart from these few realist scholars, most American scholars believe that the United States must engage its allies in Europe, in Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, perhaps ASEAN, and try and constrain China's footprint within the first island chain. It's a tough call to constrain China within the first island chain, but they're going to do everything they can to achieve that. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you.
Let me add one thing. It's very instructive what Dr. Ali said. I was recently reading, the great centenarian, Dr. Henry Kissinger. He just turned 100 years on 27th of May.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And there's a long interview they had with him. I think it was one of the publications, Financial Times or which Washington Post, I've forgotten which one. And they said, how do you deal with Russia and China? And he was had a very, not a hawkish view, similar to what Mearsheimer and others are saying. He said, we must engage Russia and try to make it part of Europe. If we don't do that, then Russia will be an extension of Chinese influence in Europe. So, this is a Cold War, realpolitik view of, the thing. And I was in Washington last year, and they were asking me about foreign policy. And I said in my speech, I'm shocked at what your policymakers are doing with the relations with these countries. I said, I must commend Nixon and Kissinger. They separated the Soviet Union from China, and they aligned China with the US. And you had a partner which helped you win the Cold War. And now what you've done is you've brought two of them together and you're making them closer together. What I said this is a silly strategy. I didn't say stupidity. Actually, it's stupidity also. But this shows a very narrow focus. People are not thinking through what are the consequences of these wrong policies of the Cold War. China has not damaged the US. China has not damaged any core interests of the US. And China is part of the international system. China is a status quo power. China is part of UN, WTO, whatever the system. And but they want to really push them together, Moscow and Beijing. Doesn't make sense to me strategically. And it's more detrimental for the US and also detrimental for the existing world order. Anyway, thank you. That's just a comment I wanted to add.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So maybe this is the end of our lecture today. Yeah. At the last, but the least, I really want to thank Senator Mashhad and Dr. Ali for all your wonderful sharing. Okay, and also I want to thank East and West Bridge for bringing each of us together today.